Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are thrilled to be joined by our guest, Dr. Ekain Zubizarreta. Listeners, Ekain is a lecturer at the University of the Basque Country in Spain, and he's also a member of the research laboratory ISP at Paris Nanterre University in France, which hosts the UNESCO Chair in Doping Studies and Analysis of Anti-Doping Policies. And today we are going to talk more about Ekain's work, the history of UNESCO's role in the anti-doping community, and the International Convention Against Doping in Sport. So, Ekain, welcome to the show today. How are you?
Thank you very much, Marie. I'm fine. Looking forward to be part of this podcast of yours. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Of course, you're welcome. We're excited to have you today. And perhaps could you start by telling us a little bit more about yourself and your current roles?
Well, you explained it quite well. I am right now lecturer in the University of the Basque Country in the north of Spain in Vitoria-Gasteiz, where I did my bachelor's. But then I moved for my master's and my PhD. I moved to France, to the Nanterre University. That's what explains my attachment also to the ISP research group. And also my link to the chair. This is main topic I did my PhD research on. My tutor or director of the PhD is the one that got this chair in the first time. So that's why I'm from the beginning also linked to the chair.
Excellent. And we mentioned some of the topics that we're going to talk about today with listeners. And I think many people may have heard of UNESCO, but may not be very familiar with what the organization does, sort of the broad scope. So, Ekain, can you give us just a general overview of UNESCO and some of the different areas that it's involved in?
Yeah, well, the whole name stands for the UNESCO institution in charge of culture, education, and sport. So it's the United Nations institution that is in charge of these three dimensions or three areas. And within these three areas, they have several different policies and conventions. They do a huge work. I'm not really fit, I think, to answer what they exactly do because I'm not part of UNESCO myself. But yeah, I'd say that it's the UNESCO institution that is in charge of sport. So for me, in my research area, it's one of the reference.
Of course. And I'd love to talk specifically about UNESCO's role in sport and their involvement in anti-doping. So can you share with us some of the history of maybe how UNESCO first got involved in anti-doping and how that has evolved over time?
Well, I'd say its involvement started with the creation of the International Convention Against Doping in Sport, if I have to say the whole name. And that was accepted in 2005. And here, its involvement came from collaboration with WADA, because the World Anti-Doping Agency is a private organization and not based on Swiss national law. So back in the time when they created the code, governments could not accept like that a code in their regulations, not the code, not the rest of the standards and tools. So WADA sought for collaboration. I'm told that at the beginning they did so with the World Health Organization, considering it is a topic of public health. But finally, it was the UNESCO that accepted, being part of this project and creating a convention, all that included as part of an annex the code, but also that created this framework and this first general regulation for the government so they could accept it and they could start working in accordance or in the same line that the code asked them to do. So it was somehow a way for WADA to ease the way that governments could accept or could ratify, implement the regulations.
That makes sense. And you mentioned the International Convention Against Doping in Sport. Can you share, Ekain, why was this convention created and what are the goals of the convention?
The main objective of the convention at the beginning was to make it possible for the governments to accept the code that WADA had created in the previous years. So UNESCO created a general framework for anti-doping and it gave it the status of international convention. So states had the possibility at least, but also kind of push towards ratification or the acceptation of this international convention. And they started doing so. And as the code was part of this international convention, part of one annex, they could start ratifying it and implementing the principle, like the different articles of this code, international regulations. The international convention itself has more of, let's say, general principles that governments accept in order to limit or eliminate doping consumption and so on. But the World Anti-Doping Code says more precisely how. WADA is the one that updates the list every year and says which laboratory is going to be used for the analysis. So these governments could now accept the regulations that WADA had created and start implementing them.
That makes sense. Can you share what are the goals of the convention? Like, what are the contents of the convention and what is it aiming to do?
Well, it's not a long convention, and I think the people that is listening to us should better go and check the convention themselves, because I would probably miss most of the points. So I think it's better if they read them themselves. But as I said, it's more talking about general principles on anti-doping, even though nowadays it's becoming more and more specific.
Absolutely. And I actually downloaded a copy of this International Convention Against Doping in Sport. Listeners, you can find a full text version on UNESCO's website. As Ekain said, it is not actually that long. So the PDF version that'll pull up is 339 pages, but it is in multiple languages. So once you find your language, the actual number of pages is very manageable. So the document touches on a lot of different areas. It kind of lays out the scope, shares some definitions, talks about the relationships with the WADA code and other international instruments. And then it also goes into some of the anti-doping activities at the level of individual nations or countries, whether that's things like domestic coordination of anti-doping activities, trying to restrict the availability of prohibited substances and methods, and thinking about not just the athlete, but also athlete support personnel, things like nutritional supplements, financial measures, doping control activities, etc. And then there's also a section on international cooperation. So talking about cooperation between anti-doping organizations and sport organizations, working with the World Anti-Doping Agency or WADA, and general international cooperation in doping control. There's also mention of this voluntary fund where states or countries, if you will, who ratify the convention can contribute to the voluntary fund to help support nations or states that might not have the resources necessary to do all of these different anti-doping related activities. And then there's another section that really goes into anti-doping related education and training, not only for athletes, but for athlete support personnel as well. And then particularly of interest to the PCC, there is this section on research, encouraging the states parties to engage in and promote anti-doping research to make sure that results from anti-doping research are shared and disseminated. And then it also touches on just kind of more general sports science research. And then there's another section which gets into the monitoring of the convention to ensure that the articles and the values of the convention are being upheld by member state parties. And there are some amendments where changes have been made along the way and some final clauses to kind of wrap things up. But it is a relatively straightforward document, and I encourage listeners to check it out. So, Ekain, we talked about what this convention is and what's in the convention. But can you share what do countries have to do in order to actually join the International Convention Against Doping in Sport?
Yeah, they have 4 different juridical forms or possibilities to join it. Again, I'm not a jurist, I'm not a law person, but what I know is that ratifying is the most common procedure, and governments have to formally ratify the convention, and they have to declare that they will work to respect their new responsibilities in relation to the anti-doping. In other words, it's a way to declare that they accept it and that they will seek to fulfill the obligations that the convention sets.
That makes sense. And do you have a sense of how many countries have already ratified the convention?
Yeah, I'm probably going to miss for 1 or 2 numbers, but it's like 196 or 198, and it's the second most ratified convention on UNESCO.
Very cool. So then let's talk about this UNESCO Anti-Doping Chair. Can you share, Ekain, who is part of this UNESCO Anti-Doping Chair and what are the responsibilities involved in this position?
Right now, I'd say like several researchers participate in the chair. Professor Patrick Traval, Professor Julie Demesle are the co-directors, and I am the other, let's say, permanent researcher. And apart from the 3 of us, there are other researchers that have been working with us in different projects. For example, Rodrigo Pardo and his colleagues from Madrid Polytechnic University, or Marco Stiger and his teams from the Brazilian University of Rio Grande do Sul. And in the future, our objective is to, say, broaden these collaborations to include other researchers. That's about who is part of the UNESCO. But what are the responsibilities? I have to say that the chair is more kind of a recognition of the work that someone has conducted, is that we have conducted an anti-doping policy application. It's more that than a working contract, if I could explain simply, like being recognized as a referent research group. It is true that at some point the secretary or the permanent bureau of the International Convention do come to us to ask for help or for opinion in particular issues, but the ones that are related to our areas of expertise. And this last year is also true that we have been solicited by several countries to evaluate the programs that they have implemented with UNESCO's help, because UNESCO has a fund where countries can donate economic resources. Money will be used by some others, like usually not the so resourceful ones in economic terms. And with these funds, they will create or improve their anti-doping system. And some, may lack juridical expertise to develop their anti-doping system. Others may lack experts in education that could conduct prevention programs. So they can present an action program and UNESCO offers them some economic resources. But as final step, an external evaluation is needed to somehow assess the impact of the program. And some countries struggle to find independent experts, and they have contacted us several times in the last years. For example, Cape Verde contacted us, or Zambia, Namibia, Armenia, and other countries. Sometimes there are countries that they already know what they want to do. They have a program and they ask for some resources to conduct this program. If it's the UNESCO funds that are giving them the resources, then it's compulsory for them to have some external evaluation at the end. So in that case, they contact us already saying, okay, we have done this work and we need to have an external evaluation. I don't know, we have a deadline, it's in 4 months. Would you be able to conduct it? We don't know of any national researcher, independent individual or group that could do it. Could you do it for us? Could you do it here in our country? And usually we try to do that. And then there is some other cases where maybe we meet representatives from these countries, the UNESCO Conference of Parties in Paris, for example, where some countries come to us as they have identified us as a chair or research chair, and several countries struggle with research. And the WADA code forces them to do some research, but scores also even in UNESCO evaluation if they do not conduct any type of research in their country. So it's also quite typical for them to come asking for help to us. Now, it is not an easy situation because we don't have all the time and resources and people that we would like to have to conduct all the researches that they propose. But sometimes we invite these countries, these representatives, to find a national potential researcher that could come to Paris for a year, maybe, or a couple of years, or even some months during these 2 years that our masters last, because we have a master in research in social sciences in anti-doping. And then this person would be the one that could conduct the different research programs or projects in their own country in the future. That's also a demand that we receive often. But as a chair like that, it doesn't come with particular responsibilities.
Well, that makes sense. And I think that's a way to help build research capacity so that then those people who have been trained abroad can come back home and help train the next generation of researchers in that country. I think that's remarkable. So can you tell us a little bit more about this master's program?
Sure. So we do offer a 2 years master's program, a research master's program. The program is in French mostly, but we do also offer some notes and some teaching courses also in English and some assistance also for students. So even if they may not be that fluid in French, they could join the masters. They get the basics on research methodology, mostly qualitative, but also some quantitative techniques. It's more and more prepared for government or NATO officials or members or some people related to national organization that would be able in the future, after finishing the master, to conduct anti-doping research on the country on their national level and to assist directly the national anti-doping organizations. So if anyone is interested in the master's program, they can definitely find more information on the website of Nanterre University.
Excellent. Well, Ekain, this sounds like a great opportunity for scientists who are interested in this area. So then can you share how the UNESCO Anti-Doping Chair maybe partners or works with other organizations like the PCC, National Anti-Doping Organizations, WADA, and just the general sport movement to really help share the best practices and protect clean sport?
Well, a couple of things here. First, I don't know how they do it, UNESCO, if they have some line doing that directly. In our case, first of all, we rarely use the term of best practice because Somehow we strongly believe, and our research has shown that anti-doping policies or solutions, let's say, are hardly transposable from one country to another, at least in most of the cases. However, we try to diffuse our results using both formal reports addressed to the UNESCO or the governments, but also scientific papers. As true, we haven't had direct collaboration until now with PCC or WADA. We did have some NATOs, but then regarding the sharing finally of our results, I think that some self-criticism is needed here because we are aware that some of the work that we have conducted has not been shared as we would like it to be. First, because we have a huge amount of daily work that makes it often difficult to take the time and share the results properly. Because remember that we have to teach with research, that's our main task, but we also have to management work, for example, directing master programs or any other type of management work. And in terms of research, we usually also have short deadlines. And once we finish a report or a study, usually we have to jump and start working full time in the next one because the deadline is already close. Leaves us with few time to ensure that our results are properly disseminated. And we have done it also often in French or in Spanish, for example, and in Portuguese. That makes the text accessible for national stakeholders, but also limits the access of part of the international readers. So somehow not all the work that we have done is being properly diffused and disseminated. And we are also aware that some other scholars that are in the same situation like we are, they managed to do so. That's why I said that we had to, some self-criticism here. Probably we have to think about some better ways to manage our resources or to organize our work. But it's also important here to say that UNESCO Chair does not come with any funding. So that's why I was also talking about recognition. Unlike other chairs, for example, WADA Chair, our chair, the UNESCO Chair, does not bring any money. So it doesn't allow us to create, for example, a full-time position in research and dissemination. So we try to collaborate with all the different stakeholders and to share our results or even best practices, to use that word, but sometimes hard to keep up with all the work.
Well, that makes sense. And I think this research dissemination is an ongoing challenge for a lot of scientists, so you're not alone.
Definitely.
But can you maybe share, do you have ideas about how the PCC could work with UNESCO or how UNESCO could work with others to further support the work that you're doing going forward?
UNESCO's work is definitely related to the states. It's not related to, let's say, international federations or big sport event organizers. So if PCC was willing to work with governments, I think then there should be several options. I'm not sure if right now I have particular opportunities in mind, but there would be definitely several options of possibilities for collaboration.
Very interesting. Are there areas of priority that UNESCO is kind of working on right now?
Yeah, there are some important areas. Right now, for example, UNESCO is trying to review the constitution of the anti-doping system itself, and they are trying to decide which responsibility and which task should be UNESCO's or WADA's. For example, in terms of government monitoring, UNESCO should be the one, as a democratic institution, that should be the one that could monitor these countries and work with them and try to foster their collaboration and their work in anti-doping. Definitely, UNESCO wouldn't have anything to do with international federations, for example.
That makes sense. And maybe can you paint a picture of just what UNESCO's role is or what you see the role is within the broader clean sport landscape when it comes to issues related to developing new anti-doping policies or perhaps revising the policies that are in place?
Well, it's not a simple answer to that question because, first of all, UNESCO also faces this difficulty of having limited resources because as UNESCO, it's a convention, it does have a really minimal funding compared to WADA that receives funding from both the Olympic movement, international federations, IOC, and from the governments, 50-50. So in terms of funding and resources, the UNESCO definitely struggles compared to WADA. It's difficult to know which point could UNESCO regulate and which one not. But for example, in my opinion, definitely things like education or prevention should be part of UNESCO's role when it comes to education and prevention in state parties, in governments. I'm not talking about federations right now because that's a different thing and that definitely should be WADA do that. Then also, as I mentioned already, work of monitoring governments and their work, that should be also part of UNESCO's obligations, I believe.
And we mentioned, of course, that you have this UNESCO anti-doping chair role and the responsibilities involved, but you're also a faculty member and researcher. So can you share, how does your work with UNESCO in this anti-doping chair role maybe complement or inform some of your academic work?
In my case, working with UNESCO helped me observe how anti-doping systems work on the governmental side. I could understand how these regulations are created and implemented first, then the NADOs are created, what is the work they do, and I could do that and observing everyday work in different NADOs. It's really, really rich and interesting because they conduct several tasks, really different from one from the other, and it's really interesting from the sociological point of view of this analysis. Otherwise, if I wasn't part of this chair and sometimes working or collaborating with UNESCO, I couldn't go knock their door and say like, hey, it's a researcher here. I want to see how you conduct or you carry out your anti-doping work, because it's also a world where there is mistrust against the others and it's not easy to have access to these realities. And for example, I do think that what our team does, it's quite innovative in terms of observing daily anti-doping work. From NADO's side. Now, we're not many of us doing that work. I couldn't do that without being part of this research and having this collaboration with UNESCO. There is also another side that, for example, participating in the conferences of parties, UNESCO let me also see or understand that politics are also involved in anti-doping. Even if we try always to give this image of neutrality, of anti-doping being something 100% scientific, not subjected to geopolitical tensions or geopolitical interests. Far from that. Anti-doping, to say differently, doping or anti-doping does not escape geopolitical conflicts. And that's also interesting. And I think it's important to say that as well, because it usually is depicted as something 100% scientific and neutral. Unfortunately, well, that could be ideal, okay, but it's not possible and it's not that way.
Definitely. I think you brought up some really good points here, that name, just UNESCO, brings this immediate credibility and trust and really opens doors for connections and research opportunities, but also thinking about and being introduced to. I think as a scientist, you're sort of, like you said, sheltered, going through the system, knowing that you're doing unbiased research and sort of seeking the truth. But I think the real world, once you step outside, does unfortunately have these biases, these conflicts of interest, these other dynamics that you have to consider when working in these real world systems like sport and anti-doping. And now let's talk a little bit more about your research. Ekain, do you have a particular project that you are working on at the moment that you're really excited about that you want to share with us?
We are finishing up a couple of reports, our last evaluations, but also generally talking, let's say, taking a break that maybe we have inherited but not taken in a while, or at least myself, because also academia kind of pushes you all the time. And I didn't stop all along the PhD. And once I was done, I said, okay, that's the moment, but then it only gets worse and worse once you are hired at the university. So last year, as a group, as part of the chair, we did submit a proposal to the WADA grants program. The idea was to conduct a comparative study in some Western African countries together with local researchers. But unfortunately, we were not selected. Since then, we did not prepare any new projects. We are a bit waiting and thinking what step we should take next.
But then on the academia side, we had been working on this idea of creating and setting up an anti-doping observatory. And the idea would be assisted by the last developments on informatics technology to create this kind of observatory where we would compile all the last researches, also news, reports, and all that is published on doping and anti-doping. We could then use it or access it easily and do research on these different corpora that we would have. So far, as a first step, we started compiling the research papers, mostly papers on journals, but also in books. We started analyzing, and we did already finished a first study on this academic research from a, let's say, general meta-research point of view, trying to see which topics do scientists focus on, which other topics are still to be developed or to be studied further. If the knowledge that we have is shared properly or not, if there are different communities that are created, or if every researcher is working on their own, let's say, and there is no connection. So we try to see all this, but for that, we are studying all the research that has been published in anti-doping. That's what we aim to do, and that's what we have in mind. It's a long process that will take us to create this observatory, but we hope that with some assistance and also maybe some collaboration with other researchers, we could manage to do that.
Well, Ekain, I think this is fascinating, and I think it's important to identify where those gaps are in the anti-doping literature, and perhaps to give our listeners a sense of all of the different kinds of research that you do. Could you maybe give us another example or two of projects or reports that you've completed within the past couple of years?
We have conducted, for example, as a team, some work on internet forums. So a report for the French Ministry of Sport. We have also conducted recently a really interesting research also in France about the situation of anti-doping knowledge in different sports federations. And then we interviewed almost up to 100 athletes from different federations. And that was really interesting to see how also sometimes regulations seem to be perfectly working, but then they do not maybe make it, or all the principles and ideas that are written in the regulations and in the laws, and maybe are not implemented 100%, or not everyone on the field can have access to that information. And that was also a really interesting one. And in my PhD, I studied the Algerian, Colombian, and South African anti-doping systems. That was also a really interesting project because I spent several months on every one of these three countries, and I could see different systems, but also different realities, different national realities. And it's a dimension that really few researchers mention. And it's really interesting to see how every country has kind of a different system, because they do have different government system, administrative system, sports system, but they all have to apply one same anti-doping regulation. Definitely having a only list of prohibited substances, that 100% makes sense. But some other regulation, for example, related to education or even research, could be maybe more tailored, depending on not kind of one size fit all regulation for everyone. So yeah, these researches that I have conducted, I think that would be the most interesting ones. Yeah, and then we also conducted like a smaller project. One of them was really interesting. We do have couple of papers published in name of my colleagues, that one of them was in the use of supplements and even prohibited substances in the gyms by recreational, let's say, athletes, but it's people that's training recreationally, not to muscle up or build up. And it was really interesting to see where they get the information from, who they would trust, who they wouldn't, how useful they found the information given by doctors, or how important they found the information given by peers without particular formation on the topic. Also, I would say that most of the projects I found them fascinating because I say they are quite original if we take a look at the general panorama of what is being written right now on the topic. But I would mention the ones that I have told you, the most interesting ones.
Definitely. I think these are fascinating projects, and they touch on a variety of different issues in anti-doping. And I know a lot of issues in anti-doping, unfortunately, remain. So, Ekain, if we gave you all of the resources that you could possibly dream up, is there one problem in anti-doping that you would most want to solve with your research?
I mean, it's a hard question to answer because there are several things that I think are necessary, but probably I would try to create some proper collaboration and communication between stakeholders. For example, creating a worldwide consultation process, and someone who tell me, consultation processes already exist. Yeah, but consultation processes, that some other colleagues also did some research on that and shows that really few of the feedback is taken seriously. It's more some instrument to legitimate a process, but actually what I would do is create this worldwide consultation process and make sure that every stakeholder can express its need and difficulties or experiences, and then create a collaborative program that will help improve the current anti-doping system, taking into account all these opinions and taking into account all the particularities of different countries, different federations. It would be related to the idea that I mentioned before, that I would try to somehow individualize some part of the current regulations that are more of one-size-fits-all solution.
Definitely. Well, I love this idea of this holistic, comprehensive, but personalized approach to anti-doping. And I think that's something that perhaps we'll work towards in the future. And I'm curious, perhaps if you were to put on your hat of the UNESCO Anti-Doping Chair, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges in anti-doping right now?
So if I have to point out some challenges of the current anti-doping situation, there are many, of course, but WADA and all the stakeholders are trying to find solutions for these major challenges, maybe regarding still the research that is needed or further develop education and prevention programs. But I would talk about the general challenge. For me, I think right now, the current anti-doping system, and especially WADA's work, it's been criticized. Let's say that WADA's legitimacy has been questioned lately, especially by some governments, let's say from the traditional Western Bloc, that's been related to management of the Russian case. The United States of America have been the harshest ones because they had also decided to pass and approve this Rodchenkov law that actually puts into question WADA's role as leader of the anti-doping system, and also somehow countries trying to take over some part of the monitoring of this anti-doping system and anti-doping regulation. And I do think that this is dangerous for the whole system because we need unified regulation and action. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense having each country trying to impose their own sanctions to the same athletes. Doesn't really make sense. Then I also believe that maybe WADA somehow went quite far or distanced themselves from the stakeholders. So I'd say that more communication is needed, closer relations with different stakeholders. For example, not only with the, let's say, more resourceful or even powerful, I don't like to use that word, but governments, but also especially with the ones that do not have so many resources and sometimes find it difficult to make their voices heard. Yeah, I would say that right now, the biggest challenge is the one of the legitimacy of WADA and its leading position, and also actually the challenge to the appropriateness of the anti-doping system that we have in place.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing your perspective. And I know we've covered a lot of ground today. Is there anything else you would like to share about your work in anti-doping or just the general anti-doping landscape?
I do have one opinion here again I would like to share. And I like to say that we often find ourselves as social scientists needing to justify the interest of the research we do. I do understand somehow that for stakeholders, the work we do is less attractive than other types of research, or maybe, I don't know, less understandable or harder to implement or harder to take advantage of. But I'd say it's definitely important. And that the biggest shifts or modification in the anti-doping approach have actually come as a result of the work from scholars in social sciences, for example. They are the ones that a long time ago suggested that the focus of the programs should be expanded and not only include the athletes at the center of them and made them responsible everything. It's in the most important point of the whole anti-doping system. But in the case of social scientists, sometimes, or at least in my case, that we also focus on institutions and on stakeholders, we study the system or the institutions themselves. And I do believe that maybe our criticism or the results that we publish are harsher to accept because somehow they criticize or they point out why or how some systems or policies or institutions are not properly working or could work better. So I do believe that one of the reasons I was saying why they don't take us that seriously, or maybe they don't fund us enough, that maybe some of these criticisms, some of these results can be taken personally, and that can hinder involvement of the stakeholders with funding and resources, that they prefer to continue funding other researchers that maybe focus on the work on laboratories or the work on athletes' behavior, that it's easy and the results are easier to accept for them because they don't point to them somehow. So do not get me wrong, like these research lines, the researchers that work on the labs and the researchers that work with studying, for example, psychological traits of athletes, these researches are definitely needed. But I do believe that research on social sciences in general, focusing in other topics, it's also necessary and should be further funded. So I wanted to take advantage of the possibility here to express this opinion.
Certainly. And I appreciate you bringing this up because I think social sciences is such a broad term that encompasses so many different kinds of research on so many different topics within anti-doping. And there is definitely value in supporting and advancing the science in the area of all of these different social science kinds of topics. So we appreciate you sharing your perspectives with us today, Ekain. If our listeners want to learn more about you and your work, what is the best way for them to do so?
I think they should be able to find our work in general databases, just searching our names, because we do have quite peculiar ones and should be easy to write Zubizarreta. Maybe the hardest thing is to write it properly, but once you write it properly, it can be easy to find, for example, my work, or same counts for the work of my colleagues, Patrick Traval or Julie Demesler. But also they could take a look at the webpage of the chair. That is part of the Nanterre University webpage. Probably that's the easiest way to access these works. But we only had some reports, links to the papers here, but not all of them. Could be a start.
Well, listeners, definitely check out this anti-doping chair website and learn more about the work that Ekain and his colleagues are doing. And Ekain, thank you so much for joining us on the show today to share more about your experiences and your knowledge in anti-doping.
Thank you very much, Mary, for inviting me. It was an honor and a pleasure.
Well, it was a pleasure to chat with you. And listeners, it's been wonderful to have you here with us as well. And if you haven't already, it would mean so much to all of us if you could take a moment to rate our podcast and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.